when I go out and judge and I see a little band come on stage that has like 15 students and they're trying to do the whole second suite, and I'm thinking, why? You don't even have the instrumentation. Why aren't we looking at chamber music? And why isn't that acceptable? Why does it have to be in this venue playing this music? Why couldn't it be? Of course, there's flex band things for, you know, grades 2 and 2, maybe 3. But there's great chamber music out there that we could be accessing, or maybe even ask somebody to compose that for us.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Everything Band, a podcast that features conversations with composers, conductors, and performers of music for winds and percussion. My name is Mark Connor. I'm a composer and educator, and each week I have the good fortune to speak with and share the stories and wisdom of musicians and teachers in the band community. I'm thrilled to announce a new partnership between the Everything Band podcast and Kaleidoscope Adventures, a full-service tour company specializing in student group travel. With a former educator as its CEO, Kaleidoscope Adventures is dedicated to changing student lives through travel to over 40 destinations. They offer high-quality service and an attention to detail that comes from more than 25 years of student travel experience. Trust Kaleidoscope's outstanding staff to focus on your group's one-of-a-kind adventure so that you can focus on everything else. The Everything Band podcast is a proud member of the Music Teachers Development Podcast Network. The Muted Network provides support in the form of audio on-demand programming designed by and for music educators. You can find more information about our network at mutedpodcasts.com. Before we begin, I'd like to thank all of you for listening. I appreciate your time and hope that you are finding value from these interviews. I rely on word of mouth and social media to bring the show to new listeners. If you think you know one or two people who might find these interviews useful, please let them know about it. You can also help by following me and sharing posts on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. Remember, help your students live up to the best that is in them through music. And now, on to my next guest, Cynthia Wagoner. Hi, Cindy.
Hi, how you doing?
I'm doing great. How are you today?
Great.
So, Cindy, can you introduce yourself to the listeners? Tell everyone why you're on the Everything Band podcast.
Sure. Well, I taught for 27 years in the state of Indiana and then decided that I was going to go back and get a PhD and teach teachers how to teach. So that's what I'm doing now. I am currently at East Carolina University, and I do everything band.
Excellent. So, Cindy, can you talk about your musical background? How did you get your start in music?
That's such a great question because everybody's stories are so interesting. I came from a really musical family, and I think that primary socialization for many of us is very important. My grandmother was a musician. She was an opera singer and a wonderful pianist, as was my mother. My dad loved jazz music, anything. I don't remember a time when I didn't go to orchestra concerts once a month. So my parents had tickets to the symphony and we just went. I remember falling asleep and having my dad carry me to the car because, after intermission, it got kind of late and very long for an 8-year-old, So there was a lot of music in my life very early on, and it was encouraged. So I think the arts were always something that was, we just did a lot of that with my parents. So in second grade, we went to the orchestra, and I wrote a paper that I found about 15 years ago that talked about watching the orchestra conductor, this is my little second grade self, saying, that's what I want to do with my life. I want to conduct. And I later played for this gentleman in college, and I was in his orchestra, and I did study conducting with him. So I think it's kind of special. I framed that letter and gave it to him before he passed away. But I don't think we can underestimate the power that those early experiences have in guiding someone. So by the time I was in high school, I told my band director that I wanted to be a high school band director. And so he kind of helped me set up opportunities to grow musically. And yeah, I just kind of never looked back. That's what I always wanted to do.
So what is your instrument?
I'm an oboe player.
Oboist. And so when did you start band?
So I started piano when I was 7, and then I sang in the church choir and the children's choir. And by the time I was 10, they moved me into the adult choir. And then I started I think I was 10 or 11 when I started playing the oboe. I wanted to play the flute. And when I walked in, the band director said, well, and it was Mr. Penry, and he told me that, every little girl wants to play flute. Don't you want to play oboe? And I was like, oh, I remember what the oboe sounds like. And he goes, well, the oboist is special. They get to do all the special things. And I thought, I'm sold. I want to do that.
Like make reeds for hours a day?
Yeah, I didn't know that part. I only knew the part that I got to play in the orchestra. And so I started playing in band and orchestra. So I was in the youth symphony. And in Terre Haute at that time, they had a training orchestra. So as soon as you could play a couple of scales, you went into the training orchestra and played there. So we did very beginning types of things. And then you moved up into the youth symphony. So by the time I was in 8th grade, I was in the full-blown youth symphony. Every Saturday of my life, I did that and played in the high school band at the same time.
So, Cynthia, you were involved then in both the orchestra, playing orchestra music and band music. And
yes.
You now teach music education. You were a band director. So how did that sort of evolve to the point where you went to college? And can you untangle that for me?
Yeah. So I thought when I came out of college that I wanted to teach orchestra and band. But at that time, this was in 1979, there simply weren't a lot of orchestra jobs open, right? And certainly not where you could do both. So I ended up teaching. I was an assistant band director at a little school, rural school in northern Indiana, one of the poorest districts in northern Indiana, and learned a lot from that experience. It was a great community. They had a great history of having a lot of students take band. So I started there and never lost my love for orchestral music, but just didn't have a lot of opportunities to teach in that arena. So ended up then changing jobs a couple of times and moving locally in that area, and ended up at a high school in Plymouth, Indiana, teaching. I assisted at the middle school and then was the instrumental director. And I started an orchestra program there with the help of the community. And we started it with first and second graders. And when I left, those students were just starting to come into the junior high. And I think I had 2 or 3 in the high school level, and I did some small ensemble things with them. And then now I'm so proud that they have a full orchestra teacher who teaches at the junior high and the high school. So I'm really proud of that community for reinstating the orchestra program along with the band program there.
The seeds you planted grew.
Yeah, it was really great. I never saw that as a challenge to the band program, because I think students have different desires, and the kinds of students that might play a string instruments probably aren't the same students that want to be in band necessarily. They could be somebody like me who wanted to do both. But so once I did that, I taught for 17 years at that school, and I had applied to be a fellow at Northwestern, which meant at that time it was a summer fellows program. So they took teachers out of the high school. You applied, and then you went for free, living and studying on campus with their master's students for 6 weeks. So you did a summer session with them. And so I was accepted into the Northwestern's program, and there were 5 of us that did that year. And I absolutely fell in love with being back in school and decided that I wanted to go back and do a PhD in music ed. I just loved working with those master's students, and they were always in my apartment, and we were doing things together. It was wonderful. It was such a great experience. And I learned I could go back to school. I was a lot older, and I thought, well, the funniest thing was going into the library and asking where the card catalog was because everything was on the computer, and
Right.
and they said it's on the computer, and I just looked at them like I mean, they had to sit down and show me what to do. I had no idea, and I did call my husband after that experience and say, I don't think I can do this. I'm not smart enough anymore. He said, you're there. That's the hardest thing, is just showing up. Just show up tomorrow and show up the next day, and it'll all work itself out. And it did.
Where did you go to undergraduate?
I went to Indiana State University.
Indiana State.
Yeah, it's in Terre Haute, Indiana. Both my parents were college professors. So, there's another little, it's that socialization, right? So I didn't go there because my parents taught there. I went there because the oboe professor there was phenomenal. He was an Eastman grad, had his doctorate from Eastman, and just a wonderful teacher, William Denton. Such a great influence. And I was studying with one of his students when I was in high school. And my parents my dad would have things to do at the office, or my mother would. And so they would say, oh, there's a concert. Do you want to go? Sure. So I would walk across campus and go to a concert while they worked in their office, and then come back when it was over. And so I had lots of experiences on the college campus before I actually went to school.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So one of the questions I like to ask my guests is to reflect on a teacher that they had either in high school or college, and talk about what lessons you may have learned from them that you continue to use today.
Oh my gosh. I tell you what, I had, there's so many, and I don't want to leave anybody out, but Judy Grimes, who was at Elmhurst College when she retired, and she's still actively teaching and adjudicating and going across the country. Such a wonderful influence, because here was a female band director who could kind of model what it was like to be a female in this male world. Because I wanted to be a high school band director, but there weren't a lot of models for that out there, except for Judy, who taught at the university lab school. So we were in and out of her classroom all the time, teaching there with her, and she would take us out and she taught a couple of classes with us, and she was such a big influence and remains that way. She came 2 years ago when my mother died. I had a gig that I was conducting close to where she was staying. She had something else she was doing there. And she drove, I think, 3 or 4 hours to come see my concert and take me to dinner. And that was the kind of teacher she was. And I just needed a friendly face at that point in my life. And she's still been there for me. So she's an incredible teacher. I still learn when I watch her work. She's just this energy and enthusiasm and love for making music. And she just makes you feel like the most special person in the world. To this day, she makes me feel special. And, I hope I can do that for her or for others someday as well. So she was a big influence. Dr. Denton, from my oboe teacher, I swear to you that I use the musicality I learned in my lessons every single day when I'm in front of students. Great influence on the way I approach music in my life. And I think from my doctorate, Dr. David Teachout from UNC Greensboro, what a teacher. I would teach so differently if I went back to teach in the public schools because of his influence, the ways in which he helped me think about things and helped me develop my own perspective on things. I was always headed the right direction, but man, what a teacher that guy is. I mean, if I could grow up and be like him, it'd be fantastic, So, yeah, probably those three stick out in my mind right now. There were some wonderful mentors, and I think this is important for all teachers when they're out there, is to find those people in your community and make a circle of people around you who are really good, who are better than you are, that inspire you to be the best. I had Penn High School, which was up the road, and Keith Rudolph. Oh my gosh, that man I mean, I could call him any time of the day or night, and he would answer my questions. And Concord High School with Max Jones, who later went on to Purdue University, was the same way. I was struggling with putting uniforms together when I first got my high school gig at Plymouth. And the uniforms were from the 1960s, and they were, the old Busbies with and they had turned orange instead of red. And I was, I knew the kids were a little embarrassed, and I was a little embarrassed. And he just called me and said, "Hey, if you can come up here, I'll give you all our old hats." So for $200, I went up and got new hats that at least made the uniforms look a little more up to date. Just people reaching out to help me and surrounding yourself with those kinds of people. David Plank from Goshen High School. There were just people all around me that I would spend time with that I learned from. That made me feel like I was growing. And I think that's not to be afraid to reach out and have those people come to your classroom. Just had them in and learn from them.
Yeah, the best thing I did when I first started my high school job was, I joke about it now that I got roped into it, but actually it turned out to be such a blessing, is that I volunteered to be on the board of directors for the local CMEA. I was in California, the local CMEA chapter, and those people became my mentors, the people who were on that committee. They were the master teachers who were offering me advice and help all the time. They were lifesavers.
Oh, yeah. And when I saw someone do something that I felt was just, incredible, I just wrote them a note or called them and told them, and then asked them how they do that. How do you get your students to do that? And what does that look like? And I would be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that I student taught at a little country school that had the phenomenal band program. And, to this day, I can call those people Terry Collins and Don Krug and Larry Clark, and I still call in and check in with them. And incredible teachers that shared forever with me, when I had a question. And I just think we have this great community, but we don't always use it. And I see my young teachers going out and they're afraid to admit what they don't know. And we're learning all the time. They just need to open up and make their mistakes and be okay with it.
Mm-hmm. It's really hard to invite people into your room or to invite criticism because it's our egos involved, and that's something that we have to learn to get over.
It is. It still is.
Yeah. It's not easy, though.
No.
So I have a question I want to bring up, and you don't have to answer it necessarily. Okay. So when did you start teaching at Plymouth High School?
That would have been 1980 through 2007.
Okay. So I had
2007. Yeah.
I had Willie Owens on the show 2 or 3 episodes ago. Mm-hmm. And Willie is a composer. I don't know if you know Willie or not.
I do, yeah.
But he grew up in Gary.
Oh, yeah. I forgot about that.
Let me pull up his notes. His high school teacher was Mrs. Betts. Do you know Mrs. Betts in Gary?
I don't.
Well, he started in the 70s, and I asked Willie, what was it like to walk into the band room and have a woman band director in the late 1970s? And I wanted to ask you how that was at those times, because we know that the numbers were dominated by male high school directors in those days, even more so than now.
Yeah.
So did you struggle with that at all?
I did, and mostly I think it's a very personal thing. I think it depends on the female. So I'm only going to speak from my own personal
Of
experience
course.
starting at that point, but I had trouble because I'm not very big. So I'm 5'3". I don't weigh very much, so I'm small in stature, and that created some problems because people would see me and say, "Well, you can't handle a high school band because you can't command you, you won't command the room."
Yes, that
So I
myth.
got a lot of that, you know, yeah. So some of it had to do with the way I physically present myself. I had to learn how to present myself more professionally, I think. When I first came out of school, that I just didn't know that that was a thing that I had to do. So it was hard getting a job because I I couldn't get anybody to let me in the door. The first principal I worked for asked me what I would do if a kid told me to go to hell. And I don't remember what my answer was, but he said, "Well, you would need to paddle them like with a paddle." And I just said, "Okay." I've never paddled a student in my life. I had no intentions to. At the end of the year, I just said yes because, I wanted the job, right? At the end of the year, when you had your little interview with him, he said, "I just want you to know that I think you've done a really good job and you handle the kids really well, but I know that you're not going to paddle them. You're always going to bring them down here to me, or you're not going to bring them down at all." And I said, "Well, that's the key. I'm not going to bring them down at all if I know you're going to hit them." I just, but that was the era that I entered
Sure.
teaching, right? And corporal punishment went away pretty quickly, but that was kind of the attitude. My high school job, when I interviewed, the principal asked me how I was going to be a mother and a high school band director.
Oh, gosh.
And I just smiled at him, and I was ready at this point, right? I've been teaching 11 years. I was kind of done with people asking me things like that.
Uh-huh.
I just said, "Well, I think the same way you're a principal and a father." And I just left it at that because yeah. I had been asked if I was going to have how many children I intended to have. I mean, that was all during that time, right? We don't want you to get pregnant and be on maternity leave, that kind of thing. And it's like, those things were not legal then, but they ask them anyway. And, you had to learn how to negotiate that. So that was the hardest thing. I didn't find it hard to deal with the really good directors that I mentioned. No one treated me differently.
It seems like these attitudes are going away. Now, we know it's not perfect yet, and we know there's still huge, huge problems with misogyny and racism and these things. But how do you counsel your young female students, the young women who you are teaching?
I do talk to them about what professionalism looks like as a female. It is different. We struggle with dress. We struggle with, sometimes we struggle with, just physical size. I don't think that's the same is true with a man. A man can be of smaller stature and no one thinks anything about it because he's a man, but a woman still has that kind of thing, particularly if they're petite and cute. Then that's sometimes they can be perceived in different ways, or they may be given the benefit of the doubt. It just depends. So I think there's still that. So we talk about how to present yourself in the best light. I don't defer to feminine kinds of responses to things, or I try not to. And that's kind of a double-edged sword because sometimes you can be thought of as being cold or heartless. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I do know what you mean. It's ridiculous, but I know what you mean.
Yeah, but we do talk about that. I don't think it's as big of a problem. I think it's more, I had counseled a teacher who did struggle a little bit with an evaluation that was different than the male counterpart. And so we did talk about ways to speak to a male authority figure about those differences without, you don't want to demean the male, but sometimes we have to do more than our male counterparts in order to get the same credit for what we do.
Yeah, and we hear that a lot. Yeah. Yeah. These are difficult issues to talk about, but I think it's important because, all of my listeners who know these, especially the women band directors out there, and I have many, I think this is something that exists, especially if you're older and of a certain time.
Yeah, and I think it's gotten easier. The older I got, the easier it got. And I think part of it is street cred.
Yeah, oh, absolutely.
You start to build some credibility. I still struggled with athletic directors dealing with me. That was hard.
Well, I know male band directors struggle with athletic directors, so it can only be amplified from there.
I think that's exactly what it was. A lot of times it was just a matter of they didn't even want to consult me or talk to me or acknowledge that, there was. So I had to push that a little bit. But, I just tried not to take it too personally. I think I took it a lot more personally when I was younger. Now I'm kind of like, you don't have to like me. And I don't have to deal with athletic directors in my position now. But I do deal with other men. And I think I'm more likely now if I hear a comment that's a little misogynistic or bordering on you wouldn't say that if I wasn't female, I just call them on it.
Yeah, and I think that's right.
And I do it in a kind way. I just want to say that I don't think you would have said it quite that way if I had been male. So let's talk about what that means and what it is you really need to say to me.
I will say it's exciting to see that the strides that are being made, especially in the past couple of years. It seems like we're accelerating towards a more diverse and inclusive band community. I think it's great. And so
yes, I do too.
I think experiences like yours only help to sort of galvanize that effort. So for people to hear it.
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, so let's get into what you're doing now, because we have a lot to talk about still. You and I had a little pre-conversation here.
Yeah.
And I know that you're at Eastern Carolina University.
Mm-hmm.
And so what are your duties there now?
Well, I just took over as department chair. So I'm doing all of those kinds of administrative things for the program. We're getting ready to look at our curriculum pretty closely. I teach instrumental methods classes. I teach woodwind methods in particular, and then I do beginning instrumental rehearsal techniques. I have taught intro to music teaching. I do a graduate class. This semester I'm doing an introduction to music technology. It's based mostly on looking at the creative ways we can use technology to assist us in doing composition and other projects within ensemble classrooms or elementary classrooms or, choir classrooms, whatever the thing is. I teach a foundations class for graduate students in music education. There's probably not a class I haven't taught. And I supervise student teachers. That's probably the big one that I do. I'm also a faculty sponsor for Sigma Alpha Iota, and I'm faculty sponsor for the Collegiate National Association for Music Education.
Let's see if I can't dig into getting some advice from my listeners from you, from all your experience and what you're doing. So let's start with the instrumental methods and the woodwind methods. Do you have one or two lessons that you think are most important that you offer your students that you want them to come out with? It could be something specific or something very general.
That's a good question. I think the most general thing is that I tell them that we just give them enough here to make them dangerous. Because it's only the beginning of their learning, right? There's so much to know about our profession. And we have to license them to teach K through 12 music. That's it. So when I came out of school, I have an instrumental music ed license. It was separate. It wasn't choral. It wasn't general music. All of my coursework was in instrumental, strings and wind and percussion. So I know what we're leaving out, and that's sometimes scary to me. I work with that's the other class I teach. I work with the vocal and string students as they learn wind instruments, which is a lot of fun, right? But they can't know everything in one semester. So that's a real challenge. So I want them to be lifelong learners. And so I try to instill in them ways in which they can continue to learn and grow when they find gaps in their own knowledge. So that's the big one. In my woodwind method class, I try to get them to understand that strong music teaching comes from making sure that you're doing what I call executive skills really well, and that you don't move on until all the students can do those things without thinking about them. Yeah, so in other words, what I see is that an experience here is that, you do headpiece sounds on flute one day, and the next day you put the instrument together and you say, okay, this is an F, here's the book in front of you, go. And that's too much. Students are overwhelmed, right? So until that mouthpiece sound is consistent and you play some games and you do some fun things on all of these things, and we do heterogeneous teaching. So I show them how to do it with all the woodwind instruments in the room, including oboes and bassoons, which I believe should be started as soon as possible, because you don't want them to sound bad when everybody else sounds good. So I really try to stress that those executive skills. So you have, you want to make sure they understand how to breathe and how to breathe into the mouthpiece and how to create the right embouchure before you put the instrument together, and then how to hold it, and then doing all of these things and teaching, making sure that before you get into teaching note literacy, right, that you're teaching oral literacy. So we work very hard on that, and I wrap that into my instrumental methods class. So they learn the appropriate way to teach oral skills, and we use Gordon music learning theory, probably a bastardized form. So I'm not gonna lie. It's not perfect, but we talk about the ways in which children learn music and how we can tap into what they know how to do and how to move that into musical notational literacy down the road, so that by the time they get to notational literacy, they're not having to think about how to create an embouchure and how to produce a good tone and how to press the buttons down. We already know how to do that. Now we're associating it with a symbol on a page. And so I think that's the big thing that I want them to come out with, is to be really good teachers of fundamental music making. And then they can learn how to teach vibrato on flute and all those things.
Sure. I have lots of stuff to unpack here with this as you talk.
Sure.
I'm a big believer in the sight before sound. I mean, the sound before sight.
Sound before sight.
I misspoke. And, the Eddie Green book on teaching band. And so I want to ask a question specific to my situation and one of my challenges, and see how you would respond to this. So I have my fourth graders 2 days a week, twice a week. And 1 day a week, I get them in 3 30-minute pullouts. So I get all my woodwinds together, and then I take my trumpets together and my trombones separately. So I have those 3 groups. I don't start percussion till 5th grade. I want them to read music first.
Great.
And so I struggle with, so that's 1 day a week. That's on Monday. On Wednesday, I have them in by class, and there's 2 fourth grade classes in the school. So I get mixed instruments. I get heterogeneous on Wednesday, homogeneous on Monday. And so I often struggle sometimes because it's hard to get just head joints when I have the heterogeneous. So I struggle a little bit to match that up. Now, my kids just took their method books out this week, so we've been working on fundamentals. But how do you deal with that mixed heterogeneous class with these sound before sight ideas?
Yeah, that is a lot harder. I think it depends on where you are in the whole process. So every week, that's You've got that?
every week, but I can move my pullouts around. Like if I want to put the saxophones with the trombones one day so I can isolate my clarinets, I can do that.
Oh, yeah. See, I think I would just play with that and see because I think a lot of times it depends on what the group is and how ready they are to move on.
Right.
I found that flute players take longer at the beginning. And I think brass players in some respects struggle a little bit.
Especially low brass.
Yeah, right at the beginning. Whereas single reeds and actually double reeds can just pretty much, that's not as hard. Maybe clarinets sometimes.
I'm finding I have some bad habits creeping into my clarinets. I need to probably take them one day separately because I need to fix some things.
Oh, well, you always need to fix things.
Right.
That's, I mean, that's the problem. And I always tell them in my classes, when I'm teaching adults who already play other instruments, we don't have the same issues. And when I give a correction, they already have experiences scaffolded that tell them what to do. So they catch on really quickly, right? And they can blow through the book in a semester. But when I get to the vocalists who've never picked up an instrument, sometimes I have tears.
You talked about the expert blind spot, that instrumentalists, we have a blind spot to our beginning years.
Yes, exactly. That's a big thing. And we just don't break it down enough to where they are successful. So generally I tell the students when they're starting to struggle with a group to go back to where you know everyone can be successful and build it back up from there. So wherever that is, whether it's with mouthpiece sounds or whether it's just playing one note, you go back to where you know that they can all do that and then move them forward again.
A student asked me, why are we starting line one again? We just did that last week. And I said, well, because we're always going to start on line one for now.
Yeah. It's just, I think it's a challenge. And I think in a lot of ways, particularly with my students, when they go out to teach, they said, well, I taught that yesterday and they came back and they can't do it. And I was like, well, just because you taught it doesn't mean they learned it. I mean, it's not about you, it's about them, So say it a different way,
I'm laughing because I'm thinking about like how many months it takes for some of my fourth graders to figure out which way the ligature goes on the clarinet.
Oh, I know. Yeah. And I think fourth grade is especially, I think that's especially a challenge.
Sure.
Because that's pretty young.
It is.
I only started, the youngest I ever started an instrumentalist was sixth grade.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't even start fifth graders.
That's young. I like it, but yeah, I'm not sure of its efficacy. I mean, I shouldn't say that because it employs me.
I mean, I think what you're doing, the setup that you're talking about sounds perfect. Even though they're struggling, like it's hard for you to get to everybody in that hetero class, the fact that they're together is probably really fun for them because band is such a social experience. So yeah, Mondays and Wednesdays probably look the same, don't they? Pretty much.
Well, what happens is my fifth graders flip that. So when I have the fourth graders for pullouts, I have the fifth graders in classes. And when I have the fifth graders in pullouts, I have the fourth graders in classes. So every day I've got some homogeneous and heterogeneous. I find the heterogeneous works great at the end of the year when we're like getting close to concert time and they can hear all the parts and, but it's in the beginning that it's more of a challenge.
Yeah, I don't think that ever goes away for any of us. It's just hard. And I think that's why people don't start double reeds too, because it just adds another layer of problems to the group.
Yeah. I think people are scared of double reeds.
Yeah, and they don't really need to be. Just find a good reed maker. And it can be somebody online, and find a good reed maker and then just, just go for it. Call somebody. As an oboe player, people call me all the time. I can give them all kinds of, I'm happy to share whatever I can to help them get going.
Sure. Sure.
But yeah, even if you started them like in sixth or seventh grade, a couple years after, I want them to start when everybody in the group isn't good yet.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because the oboe players are going to be loud when they start.
Yeah, you're making me feel a little guilty because I had a boy who comes from a musical family, and he wanted to play oboe in fourth grade, and I counseled him to play clarinet for a year.
Oh, I think that's fine.
Because fourth seems really young.
Yeah, it is. They don't, the reeds are the problem. They're just so expensive.
Right.
And yeah, so I don't have a problem with that because, just for a year, that's no big deal, especially in fourth grade to fifth grade. It's when they want to start them in high school, it puts them behind. That's all I meant.
Oh,
But
that
I
makes
think
sense.
everybody's situation is different too. I mean, I'm talking from the advantage point of being a double reed player, so it doesn't bother me to, I can pick up a knife and a kid's oboe reed and be, doing something while I'm talking to the clarinet section and having them do things. So,
All right, so there's a lot of great stuff. Cindy, there's so much to talk about. And so the other thing you do is you supervise student teachers.
Yes.
And so this is always interesting to me, is what lessons are you learning from the student teachers that you'd like to pass on to other teachers?
Oh, when I came back and I first started doing student teachers, I was going out and they would teach and I would tell them exactly what they needed to fix. Okay, instead of doing this, do this. Instead of doing this, do this. And don't say this, say this. And I was very prescriptive. And I got to the third time I was going out to see them, and one of my students said, "I can't wait till you come so you can tell me what to do." And all of a sudden, you know how you get that like panic feeling inside? I realized that was the wrong thing to do because what I was doing was making them dependent on my feedback to fix the things. I wasn't making them independent learners. And even though with the first visit, I do sometimes have to give them specific things to do because they don't have a bag of tricks. I was doing that too much. So I had to flip that. And I said, no, I'm not going to do that this time. You're going to tape yourselves teaching. I had 5 of them that year. And I said, you're each going to tape 20 minutes of your best teaching, and you're going to bring it in, and we're going to sit down together, and I'm going to make you a great breakfast, and we're going to eat, and then we're going to watch your films, and you're going to critique each other. And I sat, and I didn't say more than, 3 sentences, and I let them talk about what they were seeing and offer each other suggestions. And then at the end, I was able to kind of pull it all back together and help them see that they really could do that. They didn't need me as much as they thought they did. And so I think that's the thing I learned right away, is that we have to give them opportunities to try things and figure out what works and what doesn't work.
Yeah, you have to fail a little bit.
Yeah. Now I don't let them
right. Crater. Yeah, right.
Yeah. I mean, I'm really cautious about that, partly because it makes them so gun shy that they're afraid to try. And I don't want fear to play into that. So if I see them floundering, I have signals with my clinical teachers. And if something's going downhill fast, we have the signal and they get up and help, or I get up and help. We just don't let them completely fall apart at the beginning. So I think the big thing I would say to people who are supervising student teachers is to remember what it was like to be an absolute beginner at something. And that's where that expert blind spot comes in, because sometimes I'll have a student teacher or a clinical teacher say to me, well, I never had trouble with XYZ. And I'm thinking to myself, sure you did. You just don't remember how hard it was. Or they'll say, you don't teach your kids to do this, this, and this. Well, actually we do. They just haven't learned it yet. They aren't able to. We're asking them to do a lot. They have to transfer that pedagogical knowledge and their content knowledge, and they have to combine those and then put it into something that actually works in front of 11-year-olds. And then even though we're out in the schools a lot, if it's not your classroom, how do you learn classroom management? Because if the teacher already has classroom controls set up, right? Or the students already know what to do, then my student teachers aren't really learning that. They're just existing in what's already been provided for them.
I'll never forget that first moment of walking in, and my first job I had, I taught 7 through 12 boys, and I had one band class, and I had to teach 4 other classes to make a full-time load. And so I taught 8th grade literature to 30 boys at first period. And that first day, I was terrified. And, the first year was rough in a lot of ways, but boy, it taught me a lot about classroom management.
Yeah. So what we've done is try to get our kids out as early as possible. So our students are out in elementary classrooms, in middle school band rooms, in high school band rooms, in high school choir rooms. I mean, we just have them out, and they're not just sitting there watching, they are teaching. And they are planning the instruction, and they're doing small group lessons, and they're doing are standing up on the podium, and they're doing, our teachers in the county are wonderful. They let us be partners in this process. And I'm so grateful for that, because I think our kids learn early on what they don't know.
Mm-hmm. Do you know Darcy Williams? Do you know the After Sectionals podcast? I had a conversation. I can't remember if they had it on their show or Darcy and I talked about it when she came on mine. This is how things blend together. And in this, they have a new teacher this year with them, a new third director. And they were talking about, I think it was on their show, how they try not to interfere. They try to just let him, they don't let things go crazy, but they try to let him learn. And he talked about how helpful that is to him. I think that's really important.
Yeah, and I think it's knowing, I call it just in time, what piece of information do they need to make sure that they can, get through this. So you can give them little pieces of information that really help them grow. They were teaching, peer teaching in my classroom yesterday, and I had a student who was talking, and by the time she got to the end of whatever it is she was saying, I had forgotten what she'd asked them to do. And I'm the teacher, I'm paying attention. I knew by the look on the students' faces, they had no idea. So I just said, say it in 7 words.
I think it's interesting to record yourself and then write down the percentage of time you spent talking versus playing.
Oh, yeah. They don't do that. That's the next rotation. They have to do that. They do an analysis of that. But they already know that I'm going to say it in 7 words or less, because an 11-year-old, once you give them more than one instruction, they forget the first thing you said and they'll just do the second thing you said. They can't do all those things.
7 words or less. I'm writing this down, and I'm going to try to think about how I can apply this in my own teaching.
Yeah. Or say one thing and do it. Say one thing, do it. And so it's really funny. Once I corrected her, then she was fine. But she needed that piece at that moment, because I could tell she was spiraling and it wasn't going to be successful.
So for me, I could say, look at your screws on the right, fix it.
Yeah.
See, there it goes. There it is.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And that way you don't, I get verbose as well. So,
So last thing I want to talk about before we go on to that sort of the final set of questions is this idea that you talked to me about. You're an advocate for chamber music in band programs.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that and its importance? And maybe I think some people are intimidated by it and unsure how to do that.
Yeah, I discovered chamber music when I was in college and fell in love with a woodwind quintet. And I was doing small ensembles in high school because I sang in the choir. So we were doing trios and barbershop quartets and doing all kinds of things in small ensembles. But my high school band director didn't really do that. I did solos, but not, chamber music. And I was so in love with this. And I'm convinced that it creates independent musicians and actually feeds what you want going on in the large band classroom or the large ensemble classroom. So I set up with my colleagues who were teaching with me, Wanda Couch, and I had different people, but Wanda was there the whole time. Tim Kosh was there. Katie Briel was there at one time. I had some people come through. But we set up this great situation where our students were all involved in some kind of chamber music from November through February. And we did chamber music at least 3 days a week, where we didn't have a large band class. Everybody was divided up into chamber ensembles. And we had this rotate. It was a logistical nightmare in that we had to kind of organize everything, right? But we used bathrooms. We used, I mean, every little piece of space that we could find, we would ask permission to use. And so we had these alternating ensembles, and then we would rotate through, and there would be different people practicing in different spaces. And sometimes people who were not practicing their chamber music that particular moment might be working in sectionals on something else, or we would be doing a project that was an integrated arts project in the band room where they'd be on headphones listening and writing about, the music that we were working on, or comparing different forms, whatever the thing was at the time. So we had to have all these moving pieces, but that was happening at the high school. And it got to the point where there were so many, with 160 in the high school program, that's a lot of kids in a lot of different ensembles. So I started having this juniors and seniors would be responsible for mentoring one of the younger groups, one of the freshman and sophomore groups. And then maybe the sophomore groups would then go down to the junior high and mentor some of their groups. So we had all these moving parts. And I don't know if you're familiar with the Fish-Off competition, chamber music competition.
I am a little bit. Not.
Yeah. So that took place at Notre Dame, which is right up the road from us, right? It's half an hour away. So I always had, not always, but a lot of times I would have a group who would apply and be accepted. So they would be up studying with people at Notre Dame, as well as being coached. I had to coach them once a week. They were being coached at Notre Dame. And then they had to perform so many times in the area. And then the other responsibility I gave them is that they each had to coach an ensemble. So we had this, it was like a lot of moving parts, and sometimes it got a little crazy, and every once in a while the trombonist would go off the rails, and my husband would call me from the art room and say, the trombones are kind of loud. I would have to go down and get them because they weren't supposed to be in the lobby, and they said, it has great acoustics. Yes, but you're disrupting classes. You can't practice here. So sometimes there were some problems that we had to deal with, but most of the time the kids were so invested in this. And what we did at the end is that at the end of January, we had a convocation for the entire school, where the students decided what they were going to perform, and they would select the pieces that were the most fun for other people to listen to. And, the trombone players playing Lassus trombone in trombone choir would be a fun piece, right? So they would select those, and we would give this small ensemble chamber music concert. And the students had a choice of whether to be there or not, and it was always packed. So I think the kids enjoyed it, and I let them run it, and they introduced everything, and they did all the logistics for it. And then when we would come back together as a full band, I had different students. They were engaged in the music they were making. They understood more about balance and blend. They were making suggestions. They were running their sectionals. They knew what the problem was. If I stopped and said, what's wrong with that phrasing? Somebody would raise a hand and said, I think we need to do this. I think this is the problem. Or can we have a clarinet sectional tomorrow? These runs are just really not going well. And I didn't have to do that. They were actively engaged, and I really honestly believe it was the chamber music. And the cool thing about that mentoring process is that my students at the upper levels that went down to the middle school we started getting more middle school students engaged, and they wanted to come to high school because there was that relationship being built. But more than that, they would start like a woodwind quintet with the eighth graders that then would come into the high school, and they would stay together. There was this impetus to be part of something else. So what I would do in the summers then with the upper groups would be to pull literature and then give that to my older students and let them read through it and decide what literature they wanted to play during solo and ensemble season. And in Indiana, we did have a district solo and ensemble and a state solo and ensemble, but that wasn't the requirement. The requirement was just to play in ensembles. They could do the contest stuff if they wanted to, but they didn't have to. They could just play because we had other venues. And so then I had these groups who could go out and play a concert for local groups. They could play 2 or 3 things. So I really feel strongly that that was well worth my time, and the kids loved it. And, that grew out of my work with, I had a strong jazz program and the combo work that I did with them. I started thinking, why am I not doing this more with my, with my other bands? Why is it just jazz? Why am I, I just felt like the oral skills I was developing in jazz and the improvisation skills and the understanding of composition that we were working on in jazz, why am I not doing this in my other groups? And so, that all started to feed together to create this thing that really worked well for us.
All right, Cynthia, let's get into my final round of questions that I ask all of my guests. And so the first of these is, where do you draw the line between healthy and unhealthy competition in music?
I think that's the thing that I struggled with my entire career, because I thought when I was young that in order to be considered a good band director, I had to have a band that won awards. And then I realized that there are a ton of good teachers out there that never compete in anything, that have these wonderful programs, and that the awards are really about me, not about maybe in the way I was approaching them. I'm talking about me personally. And so I started to look at that as just, and started to switch the focus to, let's just be better today than we were yesterday. And let's figure out what that means for us and not worry about the rest. And I had a lot of people tell me I wasn't competitive enough. You could have this, state championship marching band if you just do X, Y, and Z. And it was like, but I don't want to do X, Y, and Z because those are all non-musical things. It means I have to kick out my athletes. It means that are in the marching band. It means I have to do this. So I think if the competition becomes less about the musical experience for the students and more about the extra musical things, that's where we need to stop and pull back. So I love marching band. I mean, I really do. There's nothing better than a great marching band. I was just up at Michigan State, and I went to rehearsal and then went to a performance, and there's nothing better. I mean, those kids just knock it out of the park, right? I love to go on an afternoon when I have time. I'll just go sit on the hill and listen to our marching band. It's just fun. And it's entertainment. So it's not that I don't like it, but sometimes I think we put too much emphasis on winning and judges' comments and designing the right show and all the lights and the glimmer and the revolving things. And I keep thinking, are we spending so much time and money on the things to make the show work rather than maybe putting it into helping our students have these musical experiences? And kids love marching bands. So I think that's something we should always keep asking ourselves. Am I doing this for the right reasons? Am I doing it because it gives our kids something that they need musically, maybe otherwise? Or are we doing it because we want people to know we're good at what we do? And I think we struggle with that. And I honestly believe it's because we are in the arts, we're teaching at the fringes and we don't get a lot of respect for what we do. So when we make it more like the athletics, right? More about winning and trophies and doing that, then we're getting that hit of, of importance from administrators, and we think we're advocating for the program. And I think in some cases we are, and in some cases we're selling ourselves short.
Yeah, I think you're right. Job specific too. Some programs demand it more than others.
That's very true. So there are times when people say, I really don't want to compete at the level that we have to compete at, but my principal's insisting that that's what we do. And I said, well, then you have to find a way to make it work.
Yeah, maybe at this point of your career, this is what you need to do to be successful.
Yeah, right. And so it is very contextual, but I think that's okay. I think we just need to be honest with ourselves and keep asking those questions and make sure that we're always doing it in the name of music education, not something else.
So, Cindy, how do you find, or how did you find, work-life balance in your career as a music teacher?
That's really hard. I think my children would tell you that I didn't. Maybe. They're much older now. But I also think I just spent the weekend with my daughter, so she came up to visit. And I think she has come to the conclusion that I'm just really driven. And so it doesn't matter what I'm going to do. I'm going to do it at, 100% and, at 100 miles an hour. That's just what I do. So the balance I found, though, at the high school level, I was dangerously toward burnout a couple of different times. And I found that on Wednesdays, I set that as the day when nothing happened after school. That there was nobody in the band room. At 3:20 when the bell rang, everybody cleared out by 3:30. And by 4 o'clock, I was on my way home. I just closed everything up, and that was it. Nothing for work happened on Wednesday nights. Now, that was pretty easy because Wednesday nights was a church night for my students. So, it would have been a night I couldn't have a lot of things anyway. But I just felt it was important to just kind of turn off the job because we work a lot on the weekends. And so I needed a day during the week. That saved me. And I think it's important to understand that you're going to have different balance issues at different times of your life. When my children were babies, it was harder because I had to be there with them. It wasn't fair to them. They couldn't go night after night without seeing their mother, even though I have a very supportive spouse, and he was very much engaged in the parenting, and we co-parented and co-cleaned and everything we did. It was whoever was home did the thing, right? So he was great, but you still have to invest in that relationship and build that, and they still need their mom. So it was different when they were little than when they were in elementary and middle school. They were more likely to be with me at things because, they could be trusted to do that. And then in high school, I let them make the choice about whether they were involved in what I wanted to be involved in. And my daughter chose not to. My son did. But I felt that was important that they learn to be their own person as well. So there were different balances at different times. I think it's easier now because at the collegiate level, I work the same amount of hours. I know people probably don't think that, but I probably work minimum 40, if not 60 hours a week usually, because I'm writing or going to concerts or doing, so I'm here a lot. But if I need to stay home in the morning and I don't teach until 10, because my husband has a doctor's appointment or whatever the thing is, I can do that, right? I don't have to be on campus except to teach and do my office hours. So there's a lot of flexibility. So like I was in here last night from 4 until 9 working because, well, it's quieter, first of all, less interruptions. But, I have a lot more flexibility at this level than I did when you're teaching public schools. You're just on for those 8 hours.
So, Cindy, this is a big question, and everyone answers it slightly differently. So just from your perspective, what are the challenges facing music education, and how can we best meet them?
Yeah, I think, when the band movement moved into public school education, there were places for those students to go to play in the communities. And we don't have that the way we did, 50 to 70 years ago, even, 100 years ago, maybe. So I think there's a challenge in the same things that have happened to symphony orchestras. There's a challenge of relevancy. And so the challenge of the ubiquitousness of having technology at our fingertips and having music at our fingertips and the ability to create music alone is a challenge to what we do as music educators. And I think we've known for a long time that we don't reach all of the population at the secondary level. We only reach maybe 20%. And of that 20%, most of those people are of upper middle class, right? So we're very restrictive. The diversity in our programs is not reflective of the diversity that exists in our country. So I think those are the kinds of challenges that we have in asking ourselves, how do we reach more students? How do we engage more students? How do we make ourselves relevant in this day and age? And I think those are tough questions, because it doesn't mean that we quit doing band. Doesn't mean that we quit doing orchestra or choir. It means that we open ourselves up to more possibilities, the small ensembles, jazz programs, rock bands, drumming ensembles, steel pan, different kinds of vocal ensembles, maybe availing ourselves to all the different ways that human beings are musical. And that's going to challenge us because, quite honestly, that's not the way I was trained. I mean, I was trained to be a conductor of bands and orchestras, and that's what you did. And so it's taken me a long time to kind of wrap my head around. And it was really my students. I want to do this, and I didn't know how to do that. So, well, let's do that together. Let's see what this is. So I think that's going to be a challenge for all of us. And I don't want people who are out there teaching to think, oh, well, this is doom and gloom for bands. It's not at all. I think it's just a different way of looking at what it is we do, and how to embrace all the ways that we're musical, I guess.
All right. So, Cindy, if I could give you a time machine and set it to the day of your high school graduation, what would you tell yourself?
Be less worried about, just the external pressures, and be more worried about being musical and learning as much as you can in those methods courses, and be more engaged with those who know more than you do earlier on. I think I was always worried about what people thought of me. I think that's a pretty typical younger person thing, and I wish I had been less worried about that and just more worried about who I wanted to be. And not, yeah, because that's okay. I think I think that comes with age. You get more comfortable in your own skin, but that's what I would tell that person. You're going to get comfortable in your own skin. It's okay.
All right, Cindy, this is a tough question for a lot of my guests. And it's, if you had a choice, what would be the final work for wind ensemble or band? Or I know you played orchestral music, any piece that you'd want to conduct or perform, or even just be in the audience for, and why?
My favorite piece of all time, and my students knew this, so if my students lived this, they would be able to tell right away what it was, and that's Shostakovich Festive Overture. I don't know why, it just makes me happy. And so if I would come into the band room in like kind of a sour mood, or, I was kind of mad at somebody, I would crank that up. I had surround sound in the band room. I would crank that up and just stand in the middle of the band room. And the students would laugh at me, but if they could leave me alone and just let me listen to that, I could start my day and feel fine. There's just something about that so that would make me so happy to hear, for that to be the last piece I ever heard. I think I would die just happy. So that would be it. Now, the last piece I'd want to conduct would be Lincolnshire Posy. I just think Granger is just, oh gosh, there's just something about Posy that it's just the coolest thing.
That piece is easily the runaway champion of this question.
Yeah. So I'd want to conduct that. Yeah.
How can people get in touch with you?
The easiest way is just through email. It's wagonerc@ecu.edu.
Excellent. Cynthia, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for having me. You have a great podcast. I enjoy listening to it.
Oh, I appreciate that.